Hi, this is Joey Windsor, and welcome to the Language Creation Conference 11 Conlang Relay Full Reveal. Unfortunately, we just couldn't fit more than 60 translation steps across 3 rings into the live portion of the LCC this year, so we're doing this reveal asynchronous to the live discussion. This year we had 3 rings running simultaneously, each with 20 or so participants. A prose ring, hosted by Daniel Swanson, a poetry ring, hosted by yours truly, and a conscript ring, jointly run by Alex Fink and Cy. Thank you to my co-ring masters. Your help was so much appreciated over the last couple months, and the same to the participants. You gave us lots of changes to be boggled and amused by. If you're seeing this, the live discussion has already happened, so there's no reason not to spoil our secret theme across all 3 relay rings. This year, each of the ringmasters chose to argue for a certain animal to take over as the next president of the LCS, whether you'd prefer to be led by a pangolin, as argued for in the prose ring, a jackal, as argued for in the poetry ring, or a cephalopod, as argued for in the conscript ring. This means that we've already had the vote, too, and as ringmaster for the poetry ring, I'm confident that you each did the right thing and voted for jackal. But let's hear the arguments and track how long it takes for each ring to somehow turn into a creation myth.
Hello, this is Daniel Swanson, ringmaster for the prose portion of the LCC 11 translation relay. For this relay, we decided to have a theme between the 3 rings, and also to see what would happen if the starting text wasn't a narrative. The result was 3 animals running for president of the Language Creation Society. What follows is my campaign platform for the pangolin. Kefamel antid belsioleli wanti egdidi onab hui delip egdid si lewasil lekasal kakatig sainde letakig kalulif echo sainde egdidi legusim kakatig Bomyap hui bafle ledajib buginel ebatagel leblam. Kefamel kedid si lekatig kangadal leyiwujin beutselel dachdel si yan ledajib gututin kan awit kefamel tutinah. This is Xanz, a Semitic-inspired language spoken on a semi-arid archipelago in the collaborative con-world of Siam Deen. In writing this torch, I ended up adding relative clauses, comparatives, and the imperative to the language, in addition to a variety of new words. The biggest change from my torch to the next one was due to the trees. Given the environment of Xanz, I decided that they don't have many large plants. Thus the most relevant thing for living in trees and being good at syntax was Nas'ibómmó, a species of sentient bonsai trees that form a global telepathic network. Their social role is a cross between telegraphs and Wikipedia, and this had amusing consequences for the next stage of the relay.
Che loc pengo vinni provoste di zoc po l'engaz fogar. I chute compren fort l'engaz foran. I pas mute gor casar ed apprestai po comignar a cas. Si flacon comporta letz di hivodzin, noch ira aginunde de l'Okuna. Loc pengo vin fo go jadzoli l'engaz lortem. I zoc radzau jamais en tal provost memorable. Vorau I pengo vin.
I obviously needed to coin a few compounds for this translation. Some of them, like pangolin and armadillo, definitely needed to be put into the dictionary for Matt's benefit. It seems pretty hard to tell exactly what it's referring to based on the constituents of the compound alone. Some of them, though, like club, literally specialist group, and scale, hard sheet, I didn't feel like putting in the dictionary because they felt pretty compositional, and I'm not sure whether I'd necessarily translate the same English word in the same way in a different context. For example, I might want to refer to the scales of a different animal as protect sheet or hard skin or something else. I think the real determining factor is simply the pragmatics of the relay. I needed to get pretty specific about hard sheet milk animal equals pangolin, or Matt wouldn't be able to translate accurately. whereas once that context has been established, the referent of hard sheet is pretty clear. In a similar vein, I came across some concepts in this text that I didn't already have a clear method of expressing in Jaobon, necessarily remember/memorable and communicate. The nature of Jaobon, having a closed set of morphemes, means that I couldn't just coin words a priori. I needed to decide on compositions or metaphors. I ended up going with the metaphor of adhere in someone's brain for memory and exchange ideas for communicate, nothing too non-literal. One more fun fact about the animal terms. I was originally fretting over how to create different words for pangolin versus armadillo, since I needed to construct the new terms out of descriptive compounds, and they seem like very similar animals. I was thinking I might have to resort to an east versus west distinction, since they're native to Afro-Eurasia and the Americas respectively. However, I learned that apparently, while pangolin scales are made of keratin, by the same basic mechanism as hair, claws, and porcupine quills, armadillo armor is properly dermal bone, deposited by osteocytes and made of the same material as regular bones. This was a useful way to distinguish them, so pangolins got the more generic hard sheet milk animal, while armadillos got to be bone skin milk animal.
Hi, this is Matt Pearson, creator of Okuna. I was responsible for translating the prose relay text from Jaobon into Okuna, so just a couple notes on the translation process. In some respects, translating the text out of Jaobon was extremely easy. The language has a fairly straightforward grammar, and the online resources on Jaobon were extremely clear and user-friendly, including an online dictionary that allowed me to look up words quickly. In other ways, though, translating from Jaobon was a challenge. Nearly every morpheme in the language has multiple contextually determined meanings, so I had to start assigning multiple glosses to each form before I could go about deciphering the sentences. However, once I got into it, the meanings of the sentences mostly came together. The one place where I definitely messed up was on the second to last sentence, which I think was supposed to mean something like, "The society has rarely had such a remarkable leader." But my translation from Jaobon came out as, "The society has always been close to not having a leader that attaches like this to the mind." In retrospect, I realized that attached to the mind is probably an idiom meaning remarkable. Anyway, since I didn't know what to do with that sentence, I just rendered it fairly literally in Okuna, so that no doubt contributed to changing the text. I also wanted to note that the people who speak Okuna come from a small, agrarian, post-industrial society. They don't have a concept of the internet, and they've never heard of pangolins or armadillos, so those aspects of the text had to be changed. In place of the anthropomorphic pangolin, I substituted a spirit called the Great Turtle, and rather than comparing his shell to an armadillo's, I compared it to a mussel's shell, since the Okuna live near the ocean. Finally, in place of surfing the internet, I decided that the Great Turtle spent a lot of time reading in the archives. So those cultural changes were my main contribution to the shifting meaning of the relay text.
Ger Kuna setting is tantung hina utisuna ne rarech. Ne ainuhu rungotaton inutonans ortus kaskach. Neskat nuhu sosa hetetun krachuhek getarahas kunut orta ortisunu tacho nonas chunu agot sekato hetche. Wanneer angstenke hitten noctun or sasa siteko atos kirstenuka. Ngake ke kurtes teche chuchatun hire utra ne ari chuchat nechu. No seti kurtesunu hinne nas nes chutus knuto. Ke tunche ne ngucho ha So for my section, I want to just talk a bit about some of the idioms and some of the semantics that I used in here that I find quite interesting, and they tie into the world building that this language was done for. So first, we have the idea of current going. You'll notice that there's no time phrases in this. They're all referred to instead by water. Time is conceptualized as a river by the speakers of Nair, and going with the current would thus refer to the passage of time. Next, we have horn wearing. The speakers have a religion and gender system that focuses a lot on the connection between women and cattle. As such, one of their major goddesses is a cow herself, and cow horn-shaped headpieces are worn by women in positions of power to honor and symbolize this connection. Horn wearing thus came to metaphorically refer to having any kind of significant power. Next, we have throat things. This is a way to refer to thoughts and knowledge, as the speakers of Nair think of the throat as the seat of the soul and the intellect. There is no root word or phrase to just refer to thought as an abstraction. And then finally, we have the superlative, which is against or separate from all. I just like this. I think it's a neat etymology, and I think I did a good job with it. So yeah, hope you like the translation.
Hedalos pongali pali ka e kayendera wae dero da jayodang. Taite udosi da jayodang wae witai tele ie kayendera. Porite bangbane I hedalos richarigete danoi orhi. Kim pingte I malus capo, hanak telem e kingongal aji, rihanak tele e kayendera. Chalunia najas hedalos dai da jayodang. Ya im goayal olid ayumak I pongali pali. Oli Malak Ingi, Kingo Hedalos. Hello, I am James Mãttay, and this is my torch in classical Orodachi. Nair is an interesting language, but definitely not an easy one. It took me a long time to get a semi-decent English translation, so I was a bit rushed when it came to the Orodachi. This meant that I was unable to spend as much time as I would have liked reinterpreting the text to make it more coherent and culturally relevant. Most of the changes here come from translation mistakes, particularly around pronoun reference and relations between clauses. But some were intentional, like adding the comparison between the strength of the turtle's shell and the society itself. On the plus side, the text worked pretty well with Orodachi culture as is. Worship of animal spirits is common, and these animals are used as stock characters representing certain traits. At the time, I hadn't defined any symbolism for turtles, so I added some. Turtle is highly intelligent and speaks every language. Speaking of turtles, I guessed quickly that this text was about a turtle representing the LCS in some way. When I saw the request for turtle-related phrases for the t-shirt, I assumed these were connected. But no, this turtle is actually a pangolin in disguise, apparently. One of the notable changes to the text came about as a result of my guess about the LCS. The previous text contained a nominalization of a verb meaning to recite, especially oral history. This apparently meant living memory, which makes sense in retrospect. However, I pictured a group of people coming together to give talks, which obviously meant this conference. So that's how passing from living memory became after the gathering. Going forward, I didn't expect the text to change as much as it did. I think of Orodachi as an easy language, but anything can seem easy when you're familiar enough with it. Now, let the spirit of Turtle guide us through the rest of this relay.
Right. So the torch came to me at a fairly busy time in my life, so I only had a few hours to try to decipher it. The translation I came up with was Turtle, a spirit beast belonging to a language-making guild, made a language that was easily understood but could not cause the guild to understand it. At some point he talked with a sage. The sage struck a shell, and that caused the turtle to make the language more beautiful, and everyone lived happily ever after. That's what I thought I read. I interpreted that as a parable about how we should make our conlangs beautiful and complex so people want to use them. So that is the parable that I wrote in my conlang Kihiṣer, which is spoken in ancient Mesopotamia. I made a few cultural changes. So as a Mesopotamian society, they didn't worship spirit animals. They worshipped more, Babylonian or Sumerian-style deities. So I wrote a parable about how the gods were creating language. The language was small and thin. No one wanted to use it. The gods were angry that no one wanted to speak their conlang. A wise man saw the anger of the gods. He struck a clam shell and it broke, and he struck a turtle shell and it didn't break. And the gods said, aha, if we make our language large and robust with complex grammar and many inflections, it'll not only be resilient, people will want to speak it. And thus the Kihiṣer language with its 10 noun classes and all of its verbal morphology was born, and everyone lived happily ever after. Obviously, I got some things wrong there, that I significantly changed the meaning of the parable, but at least I kept the turtle aspect out of honor to the torch I received and obviously the honor of the University of Maryland.
Diki kedo tadako kate bogi bito tato beligeto. Kokibi kate boge dako lipimika kiki pepoka. Kidi kapopeti negige dako losigida gogedana kate bogigi kesili. Mokapeki kedo tadako pato nigeka. Pakeki tigo kile tadako pato nigi kedo tetigo. Sapeni gedako geda pemato lipimimo baba metimo tako gede pilekota. Sapeni gedako geda pemato dekemo gaba metimo kidi seni gede pilekota. Tako petogeki kedo tadako losigida kase bogidi lipimigo kase bogedana dekego midoka kokibili. Deki kedo tadako kase bogi dekego papo mipego. Baka kesiki negige debi kedo tadebi kase bogigi losigo bito tedi beligeto bito tamo losito. Kasobi bopedebi papo migigida kedo tadana papo mekesili.
Isaizam cantem quipuv fin la chev ele songnu balpe mesh kaub. Iu la peng shu aublau le pavzam schaub. I chev li feg humug lau je song. I mug hus la pij le zu. Ia chahau called Yachev o. Ibavnu ya pij hu jev tachais wong ewe zu balpe song mesh haub o. Tochais wo dad nong ewe zu balpe pavzam haub o. Ibavnu ya pij hu jev tapob we shom song to nalpob we shompav. I mugjim ya chev shu jev ta al webau per song meshkaub to am webau pepav zam kaub. I mugau la chev hu fin ya ye bau pepav sai zam kaub. I jev ngu laya I ya peng yo bau lezo baungu hu kem I jev ngain bau laya leo. I ngoloi la mihu au chain blau la baungul.
Yakani pasuni kamge yani nux kuru Mãttay si chikari kaikaringes kunuksitan ni yatasaru. Ata pinuya kamge stapatasaru yo skari wungosa kamge huhupanuk. nianjitama nusa kamani yani susungi sushi handapun ni su mutuchiru nu ungosa yimishi kuas kuskuas par. Karupak kamgesa sku ninga yani yata piyani par. Shtani pak sauru kunumbai atasaru yo. Kamsuk sauru wani yani karingi sakani miski yani par. Imishkunuk shtani yuturu par.
Fetchane elierle siaisian yathatsia alza. Esian dainien vele fiatain, keraile anien kevele fiatain. Elsian yahiela vele viele isianeien. Aranien sia ania alle nialerele alza. Isian javin axere hmiershe horale viethun lewenne. Yenet yashaya lautza. Yethanalle agayele. Athanale kiannale. Fiaisian hmiershe gihmielsian alza. Kiaraile tiara ahillen kine kevenutsia. Ausia esian dainien ahinashia yellere esia vinelsia. Laiwele, laivaule. Vignele, everyone. Velsia Elietsia. My name is Elia. I'm the creator of Izeníela, which is a little artistic language I've been working on for some years now. Because I'm a huge historical linguistics nerd, I derive all my languages from proto-languages. So Izeníela derives from a sort of something akin to Proto-Indo-European. The result is that there's a lot of complexity baked into a lot of these words. I mean, it is highly fusional, and so you get some very unintuitive declensions and conjugations, and so to avoid forcing the next person in the relay to shoulder too much of a burden, to keep them from having to take a small university course on how to conjugate the Izeníelan verb, I went ahead and provided basically all the word forms as they appear in the text, directly in the dictionary, which hopefully was a bit of a convenience. As you can see, some of them are very unintuitive and sometimes just utterly unpredictable. You just have to know which words they appear on for historical reasons. I worried going into it that I had absolutely butchered the meaning, both because the preceding language was very grammatically interesting. I mean, very rich, but I felt like such an amateur trying to piece it together. I tried my best, and certainly I made some cultural changes. You'll note that a deer became a reindeer, a sort of spirit became an elf, all these sorts of little things, and you can definitely see that I've taken some liberties reshaping the narrative to make it make sense as I got it, and hopefully as I conveyed it to the next person it retained some sense of meaning. Thank you for listening.
Nayo sama aishide. Rain Ndăkaga okata aishide nisi wayata. Dina huune Ndăkaano nisi wayata. Aishide Widanita Ndăkaga. Ndăkamana nisi wayata. Nisi hakuduta ego. Ga kunamana waya ano. Desh Ndăkaga wadat. Dina kunana kunaeg. Dina aishide kawisata Ndăkaga kuanata wadat. Widanimak yaeg kuhurama aishide basaeg nisi niyama ga kusiegnuk. Wayatama danadia wadat hukuduta diaeg.
Rosio esti tioke. Ihipi bakhipisio esio eroi bhiro. Pietio spke phiti. Pzi ikipiro iopsi phai ipisti pzi. Iopipisi ese iropikhi. Nhitzie stioero opikhi. Nhitzie ste eoro opipiki. Tio phai ipipizroi. Bhai pik stipai. Bayekhi pipiphan riipa. Epipite ekhi phai. Ipopi baipsi e epire.
Vernankau, bunka yunga, kahalik, diju shiyunga, yishu kapatan, vernanka vernuka yunga, bumbung vernuka kambambanga, kainu, yi yanka mang, yi galai, yurung yung, haishin, conver nukau gunu, hoshulaka, umi kahai honu, yai din pa amuso.
Vam den hanat year. Tingot ak dead god. This at a one time in here dosh in guy ice or rock ice. Is that what? Var I god say, vam long time, vam palana tingot ship sheed me. Het shono havik, a temika mad, me got shot guidar, no time in ta palana guy ice or rock ice, have to know Valeri.
Intlis is an a posteriori language on the model of an Earth Creole, with English as the lexifying language and Klingon as the substrate. I changed very little about this text in order to make it coherent for my Khan culture. The main thing was that Klingons killed their gods, which is why this is addressed to one of the dead gods. Presumably the story takes place before they were killed. Honestly, this kind of nonsense is maybe why they got killed. The text in the previous language started with something like long years ago. I'd already established Vam dem hanat yer as a stock story starting phrase, so that was a nice correspondence. I was also able to mirror some of the grammar used in the original text. That language's verb for get angry takes inchoative as a matter of course. That's not true in Intlis, but it's pretty common for inchoative to be used in a sequential sense in narratives, so it shows up here as well in kamad. I was also able to make use of my definite evidential, the reduplicated form at the end, Valeri, to match the emphatic used in the original text's final sentence.
Be egim agebe kit. Iku agu gejufu ichimbe if chagadi abababecha. Chakat shemaya nyade nachang ngeke. Ega ideu ji ngeke. Kite egen srige kit. Gata fefe if agu eke u nyepe ngipi ede. Agu ichem if utupicha. Akakat sheeb ubuti pa ipifaki gecha. Begu da adafu gagu becha. Mansrige she maya kanachang fefe if ba ike eb Nginsrig.
Perhesh de squad sana, dragon swal jamora deo. Dur unwaket, o yo dek baraf wa bing barsha kon interse. No wastu sherki. Der jawab, promultion waket, core sharing katwa de madaldunya. Waket no yo sahaisan oshang, wo yo krodis. O yo klosisan akash kadwaron, poskoi waket, baraf o bing barsha yo tiao adunya plus de poco.
Sangat sosh savna ljut zanganet, varonjara njukachomene kamuja stoja. Chtogats, nich les tu tesha mašujnu v kura sfero, banajlo. Kamuja stasa, sagatulet, kuchama ježan čevnika v kura skasvakta. Nigajana sljorana, košechata djesa škata, echasha siguljelo. Okvabet, savaru sa špepta, chtochjanov, chlies tu tesha jaženem se zamšuja, uchemje se gržankela.
Jal tagithli kagiwi tedhek bagil. Bafle anyayi awalaben si wola binhi lebane gikudin. Latikelen wanke luli ifelek wanke tawitel lei tanbek athi teogeum tanyan wala gikudin. Tang wola banthi dalen athi thefam eja yejel dihi wola bi eduf ulen athi kanyet le futhimek begut dihi eduyitnel le belamek gontnak dihi le puhi kangudil. Echo dale awanki athi puhil. Edayel wanke lulifelek wanke tawitel et heugosel leti tanbek leti jayaj kanni gudin kanni dayi. I changed the statements about snow and hail returning to be future tense because I thought the dragon's questions made more sense if they were currently absent. In the end, the only content words that this and the original torch have in common are wound, which I think is a preservation, and serpent, which is an accidental reintroduction when I was translating dragon. Thus ends the prose ring of the LCC 11 translation relay. Thank you for listening.
Debam steltom sang dan do Dal'a jakalob singach deom. By now you know that the secret theme of the LCC 11 Conlang relay was to advocate for a particular animal to take over as president of the LCS, and from the Dal'a culture, I could think of no more fitting animal than the jackal. Dal'a culture is greatly influenced by the culture of Waterdeep in the north, and the current high poetry of Waterdeep is the sonnet. So you can see that every other line forms a rhyming couplet in the English, and that also occurs in the Dal'a translation. Additionally, there is quite a bit of consonance or alliteration in almost every line of the poem, and there is some internal rhyme between the lines, but most importantly is the sopach, or the closing. It is a matter of great pride among Dal'a poets to achieve the sopach, a poetic tradition native to Dal'a, not borrowed like the Waterdavian sonnets, stanzas, and rhyme scheme. The sopach is achieved when a poet can make the first and last word of a poem nearly identical. In this poem, the first word is samudud, a verbalizer prefix that changes the noun mudu, or word, into a verb, and the present tense suffix. This can be interpreted as calls. So the first line is literally calls the jackal within the flowing reeds. Samudud jekala vanul tochbedal. This is one of the challenges of achieving sopach. Dal'a is a rigidly verb-initial language, meaning the first verb and last word, probably a noun, need to be the same. In this poem, the last word is homodur, or great words. It's not identical to the first word, but the same root noun appears in both, satisfying the poetic device even if it isn't perfect. You can imagine perfection in this device is pretty rare. In addition to simply creating a sonnet in English and translating it while maintaining the rhyme scheme in Dal'a, I did have a few challenges. I had to invent one new morpheme for the language, an infinitive suffix that I could use to fit the rhyme scheme, but a lot of the rhyming was maintained by creating new words, adding a verbal adjective suffix to a main verb even if it should only grammatically be added to an auxiliary verb, or using not quite the right postposition so I could achieve a rhyme. Now, since this is the first leg in the relay, I won't comment on surprises from a previous language until Dal'a comes up again after about 20 translations.
Hul su filcoi za pal tupi. Fest etza na te fu nieka za efa sha ni. Fest, tiala. Tisapon tsipimaku na papatin en tu pas tu papak na petsepa simungu mahu ta Pal Een me fest. Soya senas fil fest Sen bibikasen pes nech en pat. Na papa. Chan pat Ngatu ngakant en macha. Chan vip patsen petsen en patch. Chan vip patsen petsen en match. Chan vip patsen petsen en patch. Palm fest. Chala. Achala. Kuna katu salapicha. Kuna katu saha icha. Shanya katu saha icha. Festchal. Cheche. Netza tutsa. Na papa. Matza kupitsa. Nachtetin sami. Pal Een is a language adapted to being spoken simultaneously by both participants in a conversation. It has two phonological registers, call and response. The response register, learned in primary education, maps stops into clicks and ejectives, making responses more audible to the primary speaker so that they can listen and talk at the same time. Call and response storytelling, papachuka, literally weaving stories, is a traditional form of art, education, and entertainment. The pasa, master, introduces each stanza with some topic phrases, then states the refrain, Kenya Pepe, indicated by the exclamation Napapa, or weave it, which instructs the Kune student's audience to repeat the refrain and response register throughout the rest of the stanza. Poetic conventions require the master's lines to overlay the refrain, matching in both assonance and number of beats. For instance, you should hear the click lining up with the initial T in the last line of the poem. The cultural background of the text worked well for Pal Een speakers who are very familiar with academies, discussion topics, and people who suit their manner of speech to the occasion. That's what part of having a Pal Een, literally a double tongue, is all about. The coyote seemed like a more suitable representative than the wolf, but I didn't deliberately change much else.
Le Dzadza, le Latza, Lutu Sulu Jijil. Biteberl Tepserl, Atserla Teberla, Ile la ble Peach. Dormolu Quili, Quajul Labu Palu, Dolu Uru Oro. Biteberl Tebi, Doro Tutarlo, Iberlo Levi. Usa tuchel usa ubel norodonaral. Piteberal tepseral latsa as latsanash ita piteberal. In my version of the torch, the setting has changed because when I got it, I had a torch about inducting Kayo into the university. So the question is, should he wear our robes, or choosing him as a mascot, so is he a fit symbol to represent us? This seemed to conflict with later stanzas that said that Coyote was on revealing secrets that the masters themselves weren't able to, and that the students couldn't hear him. So instead, I have the faculty being passed down a poem to study, but it's a myth ages ago where Coyote asks someone to listen to his song, and he says look closely at his voice and the form of his poem, because he's a very proud orator, just like before. Now, the original had the sense of a living deity being contemporaneous, like Coyote, and yet we're still asking, like, should we induct them into our ranks? And there's the idea of Coyote, the mischievous person. They call him mischievous. In mine, it's still associated with mischief, but it's through using a noun class to refer to all Coyote's words and the pronoun for Coyote. That's for moving objects or objects that are thought of as somewhat transient and impermanent. In Dzadza, there is, to make it a poem, putting the vowels in an interesting pattern, and also having consonants. So the words that I used to translate their first line of the refrain, I chose words with similar consonants to the second line, and then also to do the second and third refrains. Finally, there is a serial verb sort of thing. So you have give, for instance, which is to do something for someone else. So Coyote's doing you a favor by telling you this poem. And there's repetition of verbs. So tell, recount, narrate, it goes over and over like this and moves swiftly, quick, and gentle, is in the Dzadza version. And I also managed to keep the imagery. So in the original, you have him going over the landscape, therefore picking up this knowledge that is then going to be revealed. And I have, him illuminating to reveal the secrets, and my illuminate word is the same as like moonshine. And so I managed to keep the moon image and the illumination image and going across the landscape a little bit in my translation to Dzadza.
Hey, Almat man go here ta shong va anar kelish. Hey man, you got here good. Me shing lang, me got give tune. Kelish kan mat, kelish kan yell, good way I peak, I gam go kap. In tap kap, dem night vat a poor, in wood on stride, kid come shoving. Kelish come yell, I yell light, tide light kill night, kap come happy. Hey man, you got here good, you got look voice, look, car, Kelish. Kelish got mat, Captain Alman-y.
Intlis is an a posteriori language on the model of an Earth Creole, with English as the lexifying language and Klingon as the substrate. In thinking about the poetics of Intlis, I was inspired both by Anglo-Saxon poetic traditions, so short lines with alliteration, and also by reading poetry written by Klingonists in a variety of forms. This form worked well, and I liked the sound of it when read. The language has a lot of auxiliary verbs like kan, kam, kot, that ended up being easy to alliterate to each other, which helped. I changed the text significantly in some ways. Originally, this was a song of praise for Coyote, but I took Coyote in this context to be some sort of culture hero, and I figured I already had a culture hero in my Con culture, the Klingon legendary hero Kalish. Once I was singing a song about Kalish, it made sense to make it into a more narrative text, although I tried to keep a lot of the elements in the previous text, like being smart, speaking well, the light, which I think was supposed to be metaphorical in the previous text. The previous text also had a phrase at the beginning that I liked, a reduplicating phrase that meant something like, hey, listen. I settled on hey man, hey mam in this text because I liked the sound of it and it fit the 4-syllable structure of the line. One mistake on my part, I inserted a child into the text. The previous language had a root pal, which was ambiguous between gently and child, and I picked the wrong one.
Dawichasu ataha, ushnawanti widanita, daya ataha, wakibausa ataha, chimantur gani nayosama. Dawichasu ataha, shuina Ganatina, Wakibausa ati, hata, okata, kiag, nayasamana dibata, daigifa, nayosama, chimantu widanita, chimantu akaegra, daukaegra daukama ahata, dayagifa talwa, kudsata talwa, Ayuta. Hakatita Yinas Niki Daegora. Kusata Dadinena Bidita. Dayaego Dakama Ushnitakia, Chimantu Akaegra Nanumar, Nanuma Guitayama, Yinas Testim Washiegra, Ekchaegra Huuma Talwar, Dawichasu Ataha, Shuina Ga Natina, Daukama Ahata Wakibausa Atahi, Wakibausa Ati Daukama, Hanikuaya Chimantur, Hayati, Chimantu, Wanti Dauna Mana, Nukaeg, Kadeba, Wanti, Ushna, Diaeg.
Hi. For Iljena, I'm just going to tell you a bit about the verse form that I used. So, if you know anything about Iljena, you know that every word consists of a tricontinental noun root and a vocalic verb pattern. Now, the shape of the verb pattern, so where the vowels are rather than what they are, gives you a word shape. And the sequence of word shapes is what makes a poetic form. You have matching sequences of word shapes in each line of the couplet.
For my step, the translation went quite smoothly, with only a few cases where I was unsure of definitions. I mostly have just went with the text I received, which seems to be just about the gods watching over their people as the day passes. Unfortunately, I was not really able to implement any elements of the culture of Sevvufery, but, as a result, I have spent more time on the rhythm and general structure of the text. I did also use the culture I was given, of course, of the Leyen, the crepuscular bipeds with vibrissae around their bodies, with one change. Whenever the original text mentions something relating to these vibrissae, I changed this to a whisker or something related, having looked this up. Although the name of the people is kept roughly the same, beside the fact that it's spelled differently due to the rules of Sevvuferyan orthography. Note that in some cases the name of the people is omitted, as I assumed the descriptor of whiskered ones, represented by the adjective laneb, or in the plural lanebi, would be enough. As per the rhythm, Sevvuferyan literature places a lot more emphasis on the rhyming of certain syllables based on their positions in the text. For example, even though the words nichonim and suotin in the first two lines do not rhyme, the position of the o syllable is identical. It is the penultimate syllable in both cases, which is all that matters. The same applies, if to a lesser degree, with the words katonin and emunin later down the text, given that katonin is a contraction of the normal form katohunin, which, if used, would make the placement of the u syllables identical. It is again the penultimate syllable. The word order's flexibility was also heavily messed with, to the point that some sentences were even in VSO, OVS, or SVO, even though these are far from the default, which is SOV or VOS, in normal speech. I also made use of epic forms, which is of course a feature inspired by ancient Greek, as a language itself is inspired by the classical languages. If you know, you know. Now this allows more flexibility with syllable length, and this gives a different sound to the line, which I played around with, especially on the line Dorm Alvis Umiklifen. And I also made up a new word here, umiklif, which technically does not exist in the Sevvuferyan language, but it is made from the roots umik and leaf, which come from the words umikon, which means to cry, and zilif, child. And thus you can easily infer the meaning, especially if we assume that there is somebody who speaks the language like a native, or we presume what a native would speak like. I now realize that one can argue this is also inspired by ancient Greek.
Spirita pat son ideran sagats, ot ditiram bez delivrada dau. Jadzol gienil rad e jum kivau, sir poesi divin janulengats. Paco mi kiriel anosicot, gimolum nos a gith divin gada. Niton pamen nek noit a suquanda, codzante gir divan ne sisenglot. Thas tui noit doca nos dir tijon, van cau vectoeden, va dolore, que tienen toritun si vensaine, dolente de viadzur a tal fijon. Si ala zadi for hadao, no kont, I hild seida is paramont.
Jak mogi miał kiwokke, jak czaldzikeldu,
Shoyai wa rakijaldu. Milkakujang welmi wumai shoyai mulkshoki. Okase wakchalmi tuklaldu ba yapu yarwik mashitchichavik wakchalmi wiyashicha utlin. Okase yaktegich dem. Atamwa yayumimu yapu shoyai yalei tasha chaukits. Milkak yauklakit yuyut. Ukkilya wakakmukunkit yaurulchuk. Shoyai wakchamuhok milkak yakayarwik walchimi chashaklikil kow. Okamwa yehu aukitsa. Ewiwakriho khashitchukka shoyai. Akyam vaminkich dem varjinkich yelutsachtu mildu ajayalla. Achapuk chikkang yesech. Yaukivach imbushok yeleyunkich ikyo yelchito hundem. Chuva yakchal di churchal atumug yukshoya yelda yaurulchuk. Milkakil wazech yakutswai.
Damuda pen feruin era, mulade dema se feruinenet, patsidim la lisetse, gan be mulade oceanet birutmi. O kajem demao chabanla, tashtala, telamedim demao, chanashude ea simiet. Mulade ea simiet, sishusla imimu. Tamban ayashadim bizuse, burj khaybula immu. Munade bishe eas hakait. Koshiadem eau tamban, krilela, kengetla, bezem bibelaet. Lachaladadim gomarami, lulachala eringarami, kalizim tashtala. Milodem chanashude ea simiet se bush gomarait. Amulade eas imiet.
This is Daniel Swanson reading a prepared text on behalf of Merlin Florora. My apologies for any mispronunciations of proper nouns and whatnot. This is my entry for the LC11 poetry ring in Narath Krith. In the poetic form used here, lines alternate between having 8 and 7 syllables. To fit the meter, I had to make some changes to the text. For example, there were some adult deer had in a wilderness covered by old trees in front of it. I'm not sure why A123 chose to make the trees singular. I also added some instances of hyperbreton, even when this wasn't needed to fit the meter. For Dema from the previous leg, I chose the deity Anaro because of the theme of being in a forest. In the first stanza, I chose to use Veskhthit, beautiful, for sacred, since Narath Krith lacks a simple method of negation. She did not help the youngsters of the herd turned into the youngsters of the herd had to live without their help. In the second stanza, the incoming text uses the iterative aspect on the verb to speak. Narath Krith doesn't have an equivalent for that, so I compensated by pluralizing ritel, prayer. In the third stanza, the incoming text mentions singing with my great voice, which I translated to with my strength. The incoming text mentions that Dema lit the fire brightly, but the brightly part was removed, though some of that meaning is left in the following line. In the fourth stanza, the verb rechthit, subject takes the role of indirect object, takes the etha ending, marking first-person singular past perfective. However, the two instances of tha here are counted as oginithe kfa thereth. So katha, including the earlier instance, is changed to a ta, giving reteth.
Keshe jifa la puse koshe okido le lozu. Zolutilo le uhine vila do geo. Ngezuga hune ga oshe chi hune zu. Vigadole uhe hue senu pue huneo. Lo dega oshe ushe chia lo ujizive. Eti she pavu o elohe gonge o. Sheu kyudo hachi hu fenge cha hachi e Jesu. Gado helo nachi pavu jevo chi abezuo. Senuchi o kavu he o enge senuchi lozu. Ngengu ha he gonge. Kyudo ha he gonge o.
Oh no, what have I done? I seem to have made things a bit darker. What happened? Well, for the most part I translated the text I got correctly. It was written in an Oxlang, so I barely had to look at the lexicon. But I mistranslated the last line as they had cared for me, rather than they had helped me care. And the combination of that, all this mysterious meat that gets cooked and taken to someone, but surely it can't be the deer, as deer don't eat meat, and the fact that in my Khan world, Dombelus, the god of fire, is also the god of harsh wilderness survival who believes that only the toughest creatures deserve to live. Well, that all led me in a bit of a disturbing direction, and I just kind of leaned into it. The narrator wants to help the deer at first, but Falgo reminds them of the law of the forest, which convinces them to just kill and cook all of the deer instead. The moral of this poem is that the strong get to live, and the weak fall prey to the strong and perish, just like those puny deer. Don't blame me, it's all the will of Falgo, the great hunter. Another thing that happened that may or may not have consequences in the future is that I ended up removing all the first-person pronouns from the second verse. There really should be something in there to clarify that it's the narrator, not the deer, doing all that praying, but I just couldn't bring myself to put them back in because this poetic form is quite demanding, and it just sounds so much better and more musical with them removed. So I guess we'll see if anything comes of that. As for Celestial itself, it's a language spoken by angels which is obligatorily sung, which means that this poem is simultaneously a sort of hymn. I think the recording will make it clear what I mean. This isn't me setting the poem to music. The music is all phonemic.
Xanz is a personal language. Since it has no Khan culture, and I haven't stuck with any Xanz-specific poetic forms, I decided to translate the text I received into a form I favor in my English poetry, the sonnet. The text I received has the narrator realize something after killing the deer. I inferred that what the hunter realized is that they are lucky to have had the power to kill the deer, but they too are mortal and vulnerable and shouldn't take their strength for granted or see themselves as better than the deer. Sonnets consist of 14 lines of iambic pentameter. They're also rhymed, but I didn't want to create new words for the sake of a rhyme, so I came up with a pattern where not all the lines are rhymed. Daf and Saf is morphemically an identical rhyme, as Daf is a form of Saf, meaning seek or ask for. Xanz has a consonant harmony between D and Ts. It's fairly limited in scope, only spreading from tam particles and determiners onto root initial consonants. Der, law, and black, is a perfect rhyme. Lef, third person plural animate, and Zef, home, is a near rhyme, a very near rhyme. I'm probably bad at pronouncing the difference. Xanz, like the Natlang Kensiyu, contrasts 6 vowel heights. The last pair, Sash, the sound of waves crashing on the shore and washing back into the water, and Saralash, is beautiful, is a perfect rhyme. The latter word is multimorphemic. One other thing I want to point out about Xanz is the switch reference system. Like normal, there's a same subject marker, but there are 2 kinds of different subject ones. De is used when the subject of the clause was mentioned in the last clause, but in a non-subject role, and ma is used when the subject wasn't mentioned in the last clause at all. I don't know of a natural language that does this, nor another conlang for that matter. Here's the sonnet written in Xanz's non-Latin script and alphabet. Pronouns and some particles are abbreviated. If you want glosses and detailed notes, you can find them in the relay documents. To conclude, I'll read the text aloud. Listen for the nasal release ejectives, another feature to my knowledge unique to Xanz. Shadili ize wasnu gitchna wali, zaipmotzak islef zert et audim dap, whatever kostut se zandumalandis, zaipmamai berta dumas, gazguz saflef gerjav, zaisiep mashat olisu, ezuzdim kavir, edim natzadter, Mardusas landis dures, Masatsit landim bil, Shadia gazgunis gerja per, Moneat zer, Zakaliko my left zer, a muskazin chamwa, Zanliko left, Zaishangwa chanus, Ize zernitnan, Machan boat zert, a subu zinkazef, Masha my peram gong, a susko sash, Masha dia chanzer, cafe saralash.
Hello, I am Saturn, and this is my step of the poetry relay rendered in Sevvufery. I'll go ahead and do the reading real quick. Shiom hashe buzu yinba, shi kalochoga ben shawa, shi atyogai jamsen fa, shiom kakai gamo semba, teng shi hato mo kai moa, shan rua po kai yang fa, shiom hawaii shi tian hoba, fang shia shi yong chevia, ka yung chevia zu hyun fa. So you can see the translation there on the right. Let's talk about this real quick. What is a foul song? So a foul song, or a three poem, is a poetry form unique to this language. It is constrained in a few ways. One of those is that each line has to equal 9 morae. Syllables with nasal codas count for 2 morae, and everything else counts for 1 mora. Each line also has to be an independent clause. And each line has to be in a different tense from the previous 2 lines, so that each stanza essentially rotates through the 3 grammatical tenses in this language. You can see those marked by the final particle in each of these lines. There's always 3 stanzas of 3 lines in a foul song, and there's no rhyme scheme. Not really. Obviously, this sort of does rhyme since all of the tense mood particles end in a. And as a final note, just Xianru and Fangxi, these terms here, you see they're diegetic names. Xianru is a god, and Fangxi is a group of people that are highly looked up to in this culture. And that's my torch pass in 2 minutes.
Injskv, poetry works by playing with rules of syllable structure to fit phrases into a strict meter. Any segment except a stop can serve as the nucleus of a syllable. Normally this is determined by a sonority hierarchy and sandhi rules, but in poetry, these can be disobeyed to fit the meter. For example, words beginning with a glottal stop usually trigger a preceding continuant to lose its status as a syllable nucleus, instead becoming the onset of the following word. However, in poetry, this sandhi rule can be selectively ignored, resulting in an additional syllable. Similarly, voiced continuants can be selectively devoiced, making them less resonant and thus not form their own syllable nuclei, resulting in one less syllable. For my torch, I chose to render my translation in iambic tetrameter, where each line consists of 4 feet of one unstressed then one stressed syllable each. This slide shows the torch in a poetic notation, marking the locations of syllable nuclei with a stroke, stressed syllable nuclei with an acute, devoiced resonance with a ring, and liaison across word boundaries with a tie bar, in the poem as read in the appropriate poetic diction.
So let me close out this ring by saying how amazed I am at the creativity shown in this relay, the types of poetic devices, the willingness to change the text to suit the culture and poetry, and, sometimes, the creative leaps. I received Alexa's text and quickly got to translating from a vowel-less language. I wish I could have spent more time with grammar to gain a better understanding of it, but I had next to no time to get my translation done, so it was quick and dirty. I have to say, though, even if I had to take a few liberties with the text, what a beautiful poem. Oh, great moose, oh, beautiful deer. Alexa's word here was glossed as elk, moose, deer, etc., and, being Canadian, I had to go with moose. I really like how the poem became about hunting the hunter, with the deer being a hunter of grass. What a great metaphor. And how the hunter ultimately thanks the prey for the meat and the ability to build a home. I tried to retain what I could, but there were two major things I had to adapt for Dal'a. First, I had to reconfigure this back into a sonnet, finding a way to get my A-B rhyme scheme again, and I had to fulfill the sopach, the closing, so that the first and last words of the poem were the same, but then I also had to adapt the setting back into the Dal'a desert. I tried a few different animals here that could stand in for a moose or deer. I started with a camel, but I wasn't sure what a camel was going to be the hunter of. I thought of a scorpion hunting insects, but then I went back to the Dungeons & Dragons theme that this language was made for and went with the ankeg, a giant, burrowing, acid-spitting, scorpion-like insect, a truly worthy prey. Now, I don't know if you can eat the flesh of an acid-spitting, scorpion-like insect, but you can certainly build a shelter from its carapace, and if players in my game ever ask if they can eat it, I'll allow it. So, looking beyond just my final translation, it's that part of the relay where we get to compare the original and closing texts. This isn't the conscript ring, but I did render the two texts in the hieroglyphics Dal'a is written in for those who are interested. But let's get into the translations. Somewhere along the way, the gift of language was lost in the poem, but still very much honoring the creature that the poem references. But, regardless, when it comes time to vote for who will be the next president of the LCS, Jackal-dei! Up with Jackal.
Hi, I'm Cy. My husband Alex Fink and I were the ringmasters for the conscript ring in the LCC-11 relay. The relay masters wanted the different starting texts in our rings to be bound together by a common theme. We wanted something meaningful with room for whimsy that wasn't just a narrative story like most prior relays have been. Ultimately, we settled on persuasive texts, arguing for the position that some unusual animal should be the leader of a language creation society, where each ringmaster would choose a different animal and a leadership structure appropriate to their conworld. For Unnels, we chose cephalopods. Unnels draws inspiration from heptapod B in Ted Chiang's Story of Your Life. The closest thing to Chiang's heptapods on Earth are cephalopods, beings whose intelligence is decentralized and, as it were, nonlinear. We used color in our starting torch for different speakers. We hoped that might persevere through other torches, but, well, you'll see how that turned out. We structure the first text of the conscript ring as a call and response, like a union organizer's chant. The structure creates a rhetorical drive towards answering the central question, who should be LCS president, in the same way as the peripheral ones. There were 4 speakers, or, well, authors, in the text, each with their own color of pen. By looking at whose lines build on whose, you can tell what order the text was supposed to be written in. The main author uses an Unnels name based on the glyph for cephalopods, so let's call them Ceph. First, Ceph wrote the central part of the text in black. Second, the LCS wrote the central blue question, who should our leader be? You there with the brown pen, fill this in. Then Ceph added a lot of rhetorical questions in a parallel structure. The LCS, or Conlangers, has this trait. Who else has this parallel and incidentally cephalopodic trait? Fun fact, the relay preserved rhetorical questions really well. The red author, maybe another person, maybe Ceph with another pen, answered these questions with a giant cephalopod. They also added a bunch of cheers to the text using a more excitable writing style. For once, we already had most of the lexis and grammar required for this. Some new things were technically Ceph's name, allowing T to be volitional in the glyph M used T as a tool to do C, for help or use with its consent. Groups whose members are ordered. We use 2 orderings, one from inside to out to let us talk about boundary layers, the other based on a standard, i.e. a hierarchy. We also leaned on the standard morpheme to talk about organization structure elsewhere. There's a new glyph for fruit, based on the existing forms for egg, seed, etc. This depicts an added wrapping layer around the seed, i.e. the flesh of the fruit. This is the most concrete word to survive a long time in the ring and may be responsible for the cooking theme when it acquired later. And there's a whimsical extension of the timeline in a tense marker to imply it long-lived.
So the Hanguthiagon text is written in the Buchstav script, which, as you can see, is runic in style. It's made entirely of straight lines, which are all either vertical or diagonal, because it's designed to be curved on wood, and each stroke has to cut across the grain of the wood. So it is a very similar style to the Norse and Saxon runic alphabets, which it's based on. And because those alphabets were traditionally associated with magic, so that was why I used an alphabet based on them for a magical language.
Hello, this is Daniel Swanson reading a prepared text on behalf of Merlin Florora. Please excuse any errors in pronunciation. Decoding the script from the incoming text was quite easy, but the text itself didn't seem to make much sense by this point. Hanguthiagon also lacks articles and has a rigid VSO order, so my interpretations of the text differ in the choice of articles. For example, is the water in a hole in Pete's spoiler, but is there any water in the small hole for mine? In one place I interpreted 2 sentences on the same line as one, since the Buchstav has no punctuation. So, does it cut the fruit carefully, is it food or water, turned into, does it cut the fruit paying attention to whether it is food or water, which I rephrased to, when it cuts fruit, does it pay attention to whether it is food or water? For my torch, I handwrote the text in a way to make it non-trivial to decode. In addition to employing the techniques prescribed in the grammar, I often used a single stroke for the dots of u'o. I did make one error, writing Mãttay as Ea-Een.
Hello, this is Joey Windsor recording a prepared text on behalf of Beverly Little. Please forgive any mispronunciations of the proper nouns within this text. Hi, I'm Beverly Little, a conlanger and language learner. I entered the conscript ring with my language, which is called Shalti. As I started working on the torch, I soon saw that I would not be able to adequately capture the depth of inflections and nuance I saw in the text. This led me to consider an interpretation of the text as a whole to fill the gaps in my translation. I noticed the text started with a series of questions and followed them with statements. It also seemed to be on the topic of skill, knowledge, and food. Since the speakers of my language typically transfer knowledge through long-term apprenticeship and mentorship, I asked myself, what if the text is a letter written from an old eccentric cook to an apprentice? I used this as my guide for two particularly tricky parts of the translation. First, there was a piece of text which could either mean cutting by hand or cutting a hand. It didn't seem like the text was talking about an accident and the results of it, but was more reflective and thoughtful, so I decided to go with cutting by hand as an element of cooking that requires skill. Second, there was a passage which appeared to ask if a small hole was filled with water. I thought this might be a well. This led to the first major cultural adaptation of the text, because the primary speakers of Shalti live in a place where there is no water in liquid form. Shalti belongs to a fictional world called Loturkar, where it is spoken by a race of long-lived beings called Tyrians. Loturkar consists of 7 realms, each with different physical properties and overlapping in space. The cultural center of the Tyrians is the Gold Realm, where there is no liquid water. Tyrians are able to move between realms by filling and emptying themselves of the local energy of the realm, which they call lifelight. Given this context from my con world, I decided to interpret the question, "Is your well filled with water?" as an idiom meaning, "Do you have the internal resources for this challenge?" In the context of Shalti, this becomes, "Are you filled with light?" On the whole, I found it to be an interesting translation challenge, and I'm looking forward to seeing the final results of the relay.
Kranchesho yerona guksabrona vdubi isanara chol tu chesho ukoibo zdulan tu chesho uko yerona to chol tuza jejibro yerona nietan itsunamo irukomo chol kranchesho dununan chol kranchesho yerona kukuna gujeshapomo jimzansho chol jimzansho chalqarisna ngurun ochatan nyanit gubdona gumi alunamo mia mugiro ksangi lorza ikarisna chesho ocha chalchechiksho ipaira yerona huksan bailnyo ksho yeronan oharintan tuvin boribroksho jejunan ochatan krantun chesho vdubichol.
Căsure bedaliat. Iniștia de umiru ai ideea cu distra fineca de regratu, so essa surriast plu fora sa imuti. Pilat, vede hasti, abian jacat dius de srata. Iniștio deu de utru pase de bie gratia nabi am sodion usad sacri, e se eu teu dizer que fia doi plu dalu. Nu suris tentada que se te abatau o ast, se anche se saule de biano levia se dau thua et umam. Poi che pradau fia crati o desta iedru e dresh.
Udejo signor. Shapo au siudo anyas kivion yen he, ekai totak tesipishun ngaufu. Yeit shemu dauzumakem kulelia. Lapangau nya, koshepe ngauive nya ngaufu duma vobatokiash.
Here's the Valya text for the LCC-11 Conlang relay. But before I read or translate it, here's the text I received in Táyšá'a. Translating it involved a lot of color coding. Here's what I ended up with, compared to October's own English translation of their text. There were a few things that I mistakenly assumed were singular, and I misidentified polite imperatives as future statements. I also forgot a word meaning result in, which changed the meaning of that section. I also needed to change one thing. Valya is spoken on a magical island without phones or the internet, so instead of delivery, they have carts that circle around city neighborhoods. You can flag them down, request a particular food, and then they quickly whip it up with magic. They're called klakufuksuhmu, literally turning cart or cart that goes around. I had to come up with this term for the relay, but a fun coincidence helped me out. Earlier, I needed to make a word for easy or relaxing, so I derived it from the verb kufu, to pull, which was kuafu in Proto-Valya. At that time, participles were formed with the suffix i, so you get the adjective kuafui, meaning pulled or tight. Over time, that word gets used more metaphorically and eventually becomes kwahui, meaning tense or difficult. From there, add the suffix ha to negate it, and you get kwahuiha, meaning easy or relaxing. When I later realized I would need a word for cart, I thought back to that verb kufu, to pull. In modern Valya, non-human patient nouns can be formed with the prefix kla, so klakufu is something that is pulled, in this case a cart. So, although you wouldn't know it to look at the words, kwahuiha and klakufu are actually related. So here's the text translated. I'll show it alongside an interlinear gloss, a smooth English version, and another more literal translation. Trutuhyun is dilunti tuta. Klizvi tukinsa dua nyingwi hasra, pa ni shaklaf birdi pia tukinksi vingwi skapro pukumbri kwahui hasadro. Limbri dingsi pia, dvala klakufuksuhu, dvala mazi pia hrulagaviru. Kinsa dwari tuhukira susu kisumbarura, kinuri pia diskapro zvu banksotu basambri, vingwi kivanyi sabro. Tsulyango binga, trutuhyozus dululiat klakufuksuhu. Nguntunaradru hrildi daksivi nga mifpirdi ki pianya vibinga. Noa nga hrildi da kihira ki piada kidifna. Thanks for watching. Zvinwa.
Nim ilisek kella handerneg nauko. Duat ilarnur halne gelna orane di kassa duat hern nerd elikun harar. Binne eta wis eta sosk eta hina ter dua ilon. Duat larnur korek larmuinde ilgib kisun kase kisun jeris kisun denwis nerd pesieskilar. Kondre nauko mortkinek idro dua sosk. Gimmortik ilinere terkturada Bernet kassa ildirig nauda. Kella ilinere koris nauenos, lar kassa ilis. Moving on from Valya, I translated into Middle Olgish, my very oldest Conlang. It's turning 12 this summer. I had a fairly good time translating the mid bits of the torch, but I've always known that my first sentence was probably very wrong, and looking back, I was right. I don't quite know where the accusatory feeling comes from, but for some reason, when going over the torch, for me, it was very clear this was an upset person who saw their cooking not respected. So that's kind of what I went for in my translation. It's also very interesting to see how that panned out in the following translations, where it was not preserved at all. In terms of cultural adjustments, I didn't have to change very much. Most of it fit. The circling cart, I could not really fit in my con culture, so I replaced it with a sosk, a traveling merchant, possibly selling foreign exotic foods. And I'd never thought of this before, but since the word sugar was included, I had to think whether it was plausible for my con culture to know sugar and have a word for sugar. I ended up settling on a term for something more like sweet juice or fruit juice that you might also use for honey or a sweetener, which I'm quite glad to see that the sense of sugar was passed on to the following torch. In terms of translating on from this language, I think the writing system would be the bigger hurdle. As I said before, it's my very first Conlang. It's fairly standard average European. The writing system, on the other hand, I tried to evolve from the old Olgish runes. It preserves many contrasts that are no longer in the sound system of Middle Olgish. There's some symbols which represent one sound in Old Olgish that has split into two in Middle Olgish, and unless you know the exact rules, the exact syllable structure, you kind of just have to guess what word it would be, and I see now that actually caused some confusion in the next torch.
Hello, this is KGB, and this is my entry for the LCC-11 script relay. I'm using Common Kaber here. I've been working on it on and off for about a decade. It's known for its logography, which stands at over 1,500 characters. I got a text in Middle Olgish, and some of the Kaber localizations I had to make are as follows. The river rusting over implies the speaker is not having a good time. Ocean water on Ureth is iron-rich. The inland potable water is not. For the river to rust over means that backwash is coming in from the ocean, and that's not a good thing. Sight as obligation is a Kaber cognitive metaphor. It seems to have developed from a combination of possession is obligation, possession is holding, seeing is possession, and or seeing is holding. Gand, mentioned here for its cuisine, is a region in northeast Maranhir, which is a continent on Ureth. It is known for its long and rich gustatory tradition. Druids are a common fixture in Kaber culture. Obligatorily female, they are considered to be wise in the ways of the earth, and are often known for healing and dispensing advice. The omens in the salt arose due to an ambiguity in the Middle Olgish translation. It simply ascribed good times to good salt. Allomancy, which is divination through making a pendulum, filling it with salt, cutting the bottom off, and then swinging it, is a thing in Kaber society, and adding that little detail just made it a little bit more authentic.
Wow. Well, I can explain. I don't know if I have enough time to explain everything that happened here, but I'll do my best. So first of all, there are a few glyphs in the torch text that I couldn't find anywhere in the lexicon. Of course, I could probably have just asked Galen to tell me what they meant, but where's the fun in that when I could try to struggle through it anyway based on what I did understand? I figured it might do something interesting to the relay, and evidently I was correct. So that's explanation number one. The second thing is that I found some things in the torch I got that don't seem to be in the smooth translation, maybe because they're idioms or cultural things that wouldn't normally get translated. There was a bit about blood from something that had been eaten in the men's lodge, I thought, and it sounded to me like the person being addressed here had been eating a dead animal raw, and the narrator was understandably trying to suggest that they changed their eating habits. Also, there was a term used meaning show your significant other due deference, so I figured this was a married couple or some cultural equivalent. And then, towards the end, was a word related to being pregnant, and it clicked for me. This is someone's wife having weird cravings for stuff because she's pregnant, and her spouse is trying to get her to do anything but eat raw meat to satisfy them. So here's what I thought the torch I got meant. And since there were so many cultural items that don't make sense to a speaker of Azalian, I just rewrote the whole thing with a Genelin equivalent, and, well, this is the result. It was fun doing this because I got to flesh out a bit of a Genelin culture, since the situation made me think specifically of a relatively wealthy couple in one of the big coastal cities like Angajau. And since there aren't concerts per se in Izeníela, I decided to replace the concert with a trip to the inland provinces, which have a very different culture and thus different food options. Here's a recording of the text in Azalian.
Jechusso, Judoshun Jajejisho Jajere, Nebojiva Trajvo Bovo Joidamovit Pubozapelo Velushu. Yuda Budov Juspovino Jovitios Cavadagonjus Hostarak, Rastovadagonjovo Sagovo ba Mitirochanak, Shus Rafovo, Shuvolovo ba Voluzo Bazapeganak, Davel Venon Ripore Klembanianjuskia Muchur, Mavelejek Povo Jujevo Donazo Voyovo, Jeja Megaju, Majani Jinduskiori Shangi, Majovo Ujekinovo Niluvo Vatagon, Niveta Velikovo Bojios Pojuramma. Bobusheov, Jov Pavumojika Voyotchene Funnik, Ezef Jivinniko, Jov Jovodza Yojezo, Yutanacha, Jivtrosago Gangesho, Nebovinna Bojios Pojurasik Ba Miterocha.
Hello, this is Daniel Swanson reading a prepared text on behalf of Proton Donor. Please excuse any errors in pronunciation. Benzolang is a language in which information is encoded by organic chemical structures. Specifically, these structures are all modifications of benzodiazepine, a scaffold common to drugs such as Ativan, Valium, and Xanax. Specific locations on the chemical scaffold can be modified in specific ways to indicate grammatical information. Other modifications are semantic. Mixtures of chemicals are the equivalent of utterances. Because mixtures of chemicals have no particular order, there is no equivalent to word order. Instead, two compounds can be joined by structures such as esters and ethers in order to indicate coordination or subordination. One major change made to the text was to change all fantasy conworld elements from the prior text into real-world equivalents. Benzolang does not belong to any particular conworld, but implicitly exists in the real world that we inhabit, so real-world analogues had to be found for conworld-specific place names, dishes, and types of business that the previous torch incorporated. Due to the limits of how subordination works in Benzolang, a single predicate may be either the head of a dependent clause or modified by a dependent clause, but not both. As a result, many sentences were broken into two. Some sentences were simplified even further by removing clauses that I didn't think provided important information.
Comer, be damotablentimu bela orezla imo, mi potemku dev berenashiet. Niatemku isna vyrushet nalalu pakmi ekshala. Choi temku isna lisitsela et layeru fetra piliet. Devu hela, niatemku ingaet ek minguet berenashiet. Damotepse lisitselau bika ni yisras. Tisadab kokana noikwet limu, jova sein pak nine. Pak nine berenashi nalala ut pakmi.
Vkoin ka muy char vaka delari. Ak when you grippet in nuchte mal in nie gewillen la. Kugata vzinia giana die nuchte jassa. Koch me bela gulnem chamizet of meestal bij Ndăkaga. Bacha ganya bepulta polje schichenin. Gevrushnem en meestal bij hem baggen. Gab klach gevrushnem af, na mei we aan het. Nip nichtig gaan jate ko nuch kakene zanja. Ubam jake geen la. Atnem grenje chumakes visayo. Stanayo, nia nuikeru kukalana. Lumnenak bushkat unajayo. Tjunke mjake te malib lumnenak bushkata a gulnem la.
Ihilag ngoi pilit le meichui meug nal baz hisalb loveng. Ikab nau ke nau toi plaud le nin. Ia lo le gaid la jupvib hu ven. Ia tav le pish per ngev. Wine le chanagfosad. By hu pom hum kaya. Ia sis le tavke wa pish vustuv ham. Wa boyas to bol nguhab. Ia pilid le koing juin. Shu kusnu. Au plauch la songfesonod chaitsam. Huimug lo hum ngai saib la sangvansod jlipid.
I translated the conscript torch from Bawkalm to Interstellar Common. I can't actually read you my translation because Interstellar Common doesn't have a spoken form. It is a language used by a galactic civilization comprised of many different species that don't and can't share a spoken language. You're meant to read Interstellar Common by reading off the logograms in your native language instead. But I can tell you how I translated it. First, Bawkalm is not only written in cuneiform on a clay tablet, but is also written in syllable clusters like Hangul. So I first had to transliterate it to Latin letters, then transcribe it to linear text, then gloss it based on the dictionary so I could take a crack at the grammar. Translating Bawkalm was a challenge for a number of reasons, but the largest one was that I didn't realize it is a pro-drop language. So what were perfectly reasonable requests for advice in the previous torch turned into awkward rhetorical questions in Interstellar Common. I admit I used a light touch in making it more sensical. This was partly because I didn't understand what was happening with the pronoun mix-up, but also because this is a galactic civilization that has so many different cultures interacting that it's kind of anything goes. And while that made my job easier, it's not just a cop-out. It is genuinely part of the culture to accept that a passage must mean something to its writer. And people learn pretty quick to ask, "Are you sure that translated correctly?" before making assumptions and changing things in ways that might come back to bite them. The other big change I made to the torch was to reflect the galactic culture by making Earth-centric concepts more general. Thus, Spirit Hawk becomes Divine Flying Predator, and so on. Things that readers can easily translate to equivalents in their own culture.
Hi, this is Sai again with the final torch of the LCC-11 Relay conscript ring. We had to adopt the Interstellar Common torch to make more sense. Our close translation had it saying that preserved fish might or might not be a good source of preserved fish, which didn't make sense, and it didn't really follow from the situation earlier in the text. So we changed that to be the moral of the story. Similarly, the questions seem disconnected from the opening premise that the bird is somehow teaching the speaker to better provide for their children, so we reconstrued them as a sort of Socratic dialogue intended to evoke parallel answers. We changed and added a few features to Unnels for this. We used the mean and standard deviation apparatus and graphs to signal a normative value rather than the mean. We added ambush hunter with a similar shape to cat, reinterpreting the original ears element as depicting stalking and then pouncing. An ambush hunter stays still before pouncing. We added healthy as good overlaid with the biological domain emblem. And we added sweet, combining elements of the emotion system and emission system mainly used for light. We agree that the overall formation and the emotional fill-up are good, but are still considering whether the formal possibilities that the current emit system offers are appropriate for smell and taste, or if they should be modified for this. For preserved food, for now we went with something that was just compositional, but when we design a subsystem for culinary vocabulary, this will probably be made into something simpler. For fishermen, we again just used existing glyphs compositionally as fish killer. It'd probably be better to have fish hunter. We'll probably create lexis for hunting in different styles, perhaps as variations on the glyphs for animals that are defined by their hunting style, but haven't gotten around to that yet. It's a bit funny that the only things that survived the relay were some sort of dialogue, the use of rhetorical question, and fruit.